logic in me.
Hitchens Razor, the famous statement from Christopher Hitchens in a 2003 article, has become the slogan of many atheists and skeptics.
Citation needed. Who? Where? When? What atheists are saying this as their slogan? No, just gonna say that broad generalization and hope that people buy it? Okay.
What can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. At first glance, this seems reasonable and intuitive. However, when reality meets Hitchens' razor, it's not hard to see that this is perhaps the dullest philosophical razor ever put forward in the history of skepticism. If we apply what we know to be fallacious, what we know to be true, and what would follow from accepting Hitchens' razor completely, we can clearly see that Hitchens' razor is logically absurd. In applying the rules of logic and argumentation, we see that Hitchens' razor commits two obvious fallacies. The first problem and the first fallacy committed is the fallacy fallacy. This is committed when you reject a conclusion because it is argued for in a fallacious manner. One can argue for a true or false conclusion with a bad argument, but that doesn't warrant a dismissal of the conclusion.
The fallacy fallacy occurs if and when you say that a conclusion is false or not true because the argument sucks or is invalid. It is not when you say, I'm going to dismiss your conclusion because your argument sucked. It's very different. And the wording is very different. And you've deliberately put in your conclusion about Hitchens' razor into the definition of the fallacy fallacy to make this complaint hold. But it's not sound and it's not valid because your complaint only works if you identify the logical fallacy correctly, and you haven't.
For instance, I might argue that the Earth is flat, and I might make my case by dismissing all contrary evidence because it comes from a corrupt government. In this instance, I'd be committing the ad hominem fallacy.
I'll give credit where credit's due. You understood what an ad hominem is.
But that doesn't mean that the Earth isn't flat. It just means that I've argued for it in the wrong way. If you'd like to reject the flat Earth model, you'd have to provide an argument of your own against it, not just appeal to my fallacious argument.
Here's where this whole thing breaks down, and I don't know if it's you or if it's people in general or what to make of this, but it's been cropping up here and there that I've noticed as of late that people are using the fallacy fallacy very incorrectly. And it's a question that I would pose to anyone out there, you included. Why bother identifying any logical fallacies at all if the fallacy fallacy is really, at the end of the day, just, well, it doesn't mean anything. The conclusion could still be false or true. So why did we identify whatever logical fallacies there were? What was the point of doing that? Who cares? And who would care about the syllogisms? Why even bother with premises in the first place if at the end of the day we could just say, well, it could still be true or false? The reason that analysis is done of both natural language within informal logic and formalized language within formal logic is to deconstruct the argument and see whether or not it is fallacious. If it's not, then the conclusion should follow. And every time so far, it has, when you use proper logic. But when you introduce a logical fallacy, then the formula stops working and the conclusion doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. So you have to be skeptical that that conclusion is true. It might be true, but you have no reason to think that it's true. So, because you're skeptical about it, that leaves the burden on the one that made the argument in the first place. And if they're unwilling or unable to fix their argument, or just present you with evidence in the first place, and if you had evidence, you wouldn't really even need an argument per se, then you're free to dismiss their conclusion and walk away. You don't need to give them the time of day, because they haven't satisfied the requirement of fulfilling a logically valid and sound argumentation and or giving you some sort of evidence that would convince you that this thing is true, whatever that evidence might be. And no, you don't have to argue against the fallacious argument. All you have to do is point out at least one logical fallacy and say, well, I'm skeptical of your conclusion. You can respond, well, it could still be true, it could still be true. And I can say, yeah, you're right, it could still be true. But your argument sucks, go fix it. And once you fix it, come back and let me know. And we'll try this again. Until then, I'm done. I'm not going to argue with you. I don't need to. Your argument sucked. Go fix it. Why should I argue your conclusion when your argument sucks? That would make the whole point of doing analysis completely pointless. And it would also make every other logical fallacy completely pointless. So here's an idea. Learn informal logic, learn formal logic, then understand the fallacy correctly. Then you'll understand why Hitchens Razor is perfectly fine. But you have more to say, so I have to cover that.
Hitchens Razor says that if a conclusion can be argued for in a fallacious manner by neglecting some form of the burden of proof, then the conclusion can be rejected.
But that's not what you said it said in the beginning. You said this.
What can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. Hitchens Razor says that if a conclusion can be argued for in a fallacious manner by neglecting some form of the burden of proof, then the conclusion can be rejected.
So you've rewritten this in a completely dishonest manner and made it into a completely different statement and thus a different argument. There's a word for that. Straw man. I'm a straw man. I'm a straw man.
Effectively, Hitchens Razor can be used to shave away everything. Yes, everything, because anything can be asserted without evidence. I can assert general relativity without evidence. I can assert the laws of motion without evidence. I can go on for hours making bad arguments for true statements.
Yeah, and if you did any of that, we should reject your conclusions because you didn't give evidence. Although I'm not sure how you could do those first two without giving some sort of evidence.
But that doesn't make any of those statements false, and that doesn't mean that you can reject them.
Actually, no. We can reject your conclusion because your argument did suck. No, that doesn't make your conclusion true, but you have failed your burden of proof. And for that reason alone, I should dismiss your argument and or conclusion because you haven't proven it. Your argument sucked. Go back to the drawing board. You failed. Try again.
This is why Hitchens Razor is a textbook example of the fallacy fallacy.
Hitchens Razor is basically burden of proof. Hitchens Razor is basically the burden of proof. That's really all it's doing is asking you to prove what you said is true by shouldering the burden of proof. Bump, bump.
The second problem and the second fallacy committed by Hitchens Razor is the fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. The burden of proof is the obligation in argumentation to provide reasons or justifications for the proposition you're defending. If I'd like to argue that Hawaiian pizza is spawn of Satan, though I think this is self-evident, I have an obligation to give reasons and justification for that claim. I have a burden of proof. To shift the burden of proof is to neglect it by putting it on someone else. That person may or may not have a burden of proof of their own, but to have a burden of proof, yet claim only your opponent does, is to commit the fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. If I stood up to a podium, asserted the satanic nature of pineapple pizza, and substantiated it by saying, "Prove to me that there's no demonic presence within this pizza," I'd be shifting the burden of proof. I'd be putting it on someone else, even though I have it.
Yes, and if you made this silly argument about Hawaiian pizza being possessed by Satan, and then said, and you need to prove that it's not possessed by Satan, I could simply say either, well, you've committed a logical fallacy, so I have to be skeptical of the conclusion, or you've asserted it without proof, so I can dismiss it without proof. It's still your turn. Please prove that the pizza is possessed by Satan.
In the instance of Hitchens Razor, both the person making the first assertion and the person rejecting it have a burden of proof. Despite this, Hitchens claims that if the person making the first assertion fails to meet his burden of proof, that you can go ahead and fail to meet yours in rejecting it.
Even in a symmetrical dialogue where we both have the burden of proof, if you fail to uphold your burden of proof, I can say I dismiss your side because you failed to uphold the burden of proof. I still need to present my burden of proof for my argument, but that's different from having to refute your argument. You've already done that job for me. Now, in an asymmetrical dialogue, it's even worse, because there I'm merely the skeptic, and I don't have anything to prove. I'm just doubting what it is you're claiming, and your job is to prove that your claim is true. And if you fail to do that, I get to keep being a skeptic. In either case, the Hitchens Razor still applies, and you still failed to uphold your burden of proof. Oops!
Now, it's often thought that if you are rejecting a claim, you don't have the burden of proof because you're not actually making a claim. However, rejecting a claim is still making a claim because you are negating the claim.
What universe is that true? It's not this universe. Where do you get this idea? No, that's not how it works. There are leprechauns. So if you say there are no leprechauns, now you have to prove that there are no leprechauns? Do you really? No! Or you could say, I'm skeptical of leprechauns. Aha! You must prove that there are no leprechauns. But I'm skeptical. That doesn't mean that I think there are or are not. Being skeptical is being doubtful. It doesn't mean that they're not there. I'm not saying that they're not there. I'm not saying that they are there. I'm just saying that I doubt it either way. And it's up to you to prove it. Oh, but that means you have to prove it now. This is how theist apologetics melts your brain. Alright, so he's got more video. And if you really, really want me to keep going, I will. Just let me know in the comments below. But for now, I'm done with this insanity. Because, for one, people like shorter videos. And secondly, my mind will completely melt into absolute goo if I keep going on the same day. So I'm going to need a break between doing more of this nonsense. So, until we have a valid words, then I don't even, there goes my brain.